A 17-year-old girl goes missing in Phoenix, Arizona. Police are told that she'd run away, but there's still no sign of her 19 years later. What happened to Alissa Turney? My name's Adrian, and today we're looking at the case of Alissa Turney. This is a tough one, so grab a coffee and relax. Let's investigate. Alyssa was born in 1984. In 1987, her mother, Barbara Stram, married Mike Turney, who would become Alyssa's stepfather along with 3 of her biological brothers. Alyssa's mother and stepfather would soon have one child together afterwards, Sarah Turney. To great tragedy, Sarah's mother, Barbara, was diagnosed with cancer in 1993. She unfortunately died a year later. Turney's sons, who were all grown up at this point, had moved out of the house, so it was left to Mike Turney to look after and help raise Sarah Turney and Alyssa Turney. Alyssa was a normal teenager. She was young and she was starting to grow into herself and her own independence. She was doing fine at school, had a part-time job, had a boyfriend. She was funny and she had a positive nature. People liked her. In 2001, Alyssa was 17, and on May the 17th, 2001, on her last day of her junior year at Paradise Valley High School, she went missing. Her stepfather, Michael Turney, said that he picked her up around noon and they went out together for lunch. Evidently, they'd got into an argument over lunch, mostly about Sarah's independence and how she wanted to do her own thing, and after this, they went home. When they returned home, she stormed off into her bedroom. She was in a bad mood. Michael then says he left the house around at 1 o'clock and he went out to run a few errands before picking Sarah up from school. He tried to call Alyssa, but there was no answer. And when he returned home around about 5 o'clock, Alyssa was gone. Apparently she left a note behind and it said, "Dad and Sarah, when you dropped me off at school today, I decided I really am going to California. Sarah, you said you really wanted me gone? Now you have it. Dad, I took $300 from you. That's why I saved my money. Alyssa." Mike says that she called him a week later from a payphone in California. The conversation was abrupt, and it quickly ended after Alyssa swore at Mike on the phone. This would be the last apparent contact from Alyssa ever. So this is where things start to get a little odd. In the initial days of Alyssa's disappearance, her stepfather Mike downplayed the incident to the police. He called the police at around about 11 p.m. and he reported that she'd run away to California. Since Mike claimed that it was a runaway and not an abduction, no investigation was conducted. Contrarily, he tried to cause as much panic and urgency inside the family's 4 walls. He was, quite frankly, a mess. Mike began to tell family and friends of Alyssa that he thought something bad had happened to her. He told them that he thought someone may have been following her on the day that she went missing, and even worse, could have caused harm to her. And since the police weren't doing anything, he needed to do it himself. So he made a few trips to California to search for Alyssa and hand out missing flyers. So fast forward to 2008, this is 7 years after Alyssa had disappeared. She had not contacted a single one of her friends or any of her family. That included her aunt, who she was apparently running away to. She also had a bank account under her name. The bank account had $1,800 in there to begin with, and that was never touched. Her social security number was never used, meaning she had never got a job in the 7 years that she'd disappeared. And her school records remained untouched. It became clear to the police over time that they were not dealing with a runaway case anymore. Something had happened to Alyssa and they wanted to know what. Backtracking on her events, the police discovered that Alyssa had not been in school for the entire day on the day that she went missing. They learned that Michael had picked her up for lunch, and her boyfriend back in 2001 had confirmed this to the police. Her boyfriend also told the police that she'd said to him that she would see him later on at the after-school party. Meanwhile, Alyssa's sister, Sarah, She was also starting to question history. She found from police reports that Mike had stated to the police that he picked up Sarah from school, and when the two of them had returned, Alyssa was gone. But that didn't happen. What Sarah claims had actually happened is that her father, Mike, had failed to show up at the end of Sarah's school day. She ended up walking to a friend's house, where he then finally picked her up after 5 p.m. At this point, Mike had informed Sarah that Alyssa was missing, and when they got home, they found the note. So Sarah and the police, they both decided to do a little more digging. They learned that Michael was actually a very controlling and paranoid man. He had recorders implanted into the family's landline phone. He placed cameras on the outside of the property. He even had a camera inside the vent looking into the living room over the sofa. We know this because we'll find out later on that Michael actually had recorded videos of Alyssa on the sofa with her boyfriend. So when the police asked for the recorders and the videos of the day that Alyssa had gone missing, Mike had told them that there was no useful information on those recorders on the day. All this suspicious and strange activity actually encouraged the police to conduct a search warrant on Mike's house. And this is where things start to get really bizarre. In December 2008, federal agents were deployed to raid Mike's house. They were hoping to find recordings of the surveillance systems that Mike had implemented into his property on the day that Alyssa had gone missing, in case these files may potentially hold clues as to her whereabouts. So they waited for Mike to leave his front door, and approximately 8:30 in the morning, as Mike went down to grab his newspaper at the end of his driveway, they seized Mike in his pajamas. They found they had 2 pistols, a knife, and some pistol magazines attached to his body, just to collect the newspaper. Things got even worse inside the property. The federal agents found 26 homemade pipe bombs, 3 fire bombs, dozens of handguns, several rifles, weapon attachments, and a ballistic vest. His truck was rigged with explosive canisters, and they found a 96-page testimonial written by Mike describing how the Electrical Workers Union was responsible for the disappearance of Alyssa. So a bit of backstory. In the 1980s, Turney had worked as an electrician. During his time there, he'd complained about the working conditions and also of his colleagues. And people had enough. They fired him. It eventually led to him losing his job. You could say he was a little short-fused. He had recently told the police that the union had a grudge against him, and they were to blame for the disappearance of Alyssa. He claimed that they kidnapped and killed her to punish him. In the writings found by the federal agents, Turney indicated that he wanted to avenge Alyssa's death by attacking the union. You see, Turney had an operational plan. He wanted to do this by driving an explosives-laden truck into the Union Hall, and then shoot any survivors that ran out from where the truck had exploded. I'm sorry, this just sounds so bizarre. The authorities also believed that the attack on the Union Hall was imminent. In fact, they served the search warrant on December the 11th, and the next meeting for that Union Hall was on December the 15th, only 4 days later. Police also found more homemade tapes of Alyssa, along with contracts that Mike Turney had forced Alyssa to sign. One of these contracts was dated roughly a year before Alyssa's disappearance. It had contracted to make a promise that she would never report that Mike Turney had abused her. In 2010, Michael Turney was sentenced to 10 years in prison for possessing a large case of fully functional bombs. He only got 10 years for that. In his only interview to date, Mike Turney told ABC News he believes that the police framed him by planting the bombs there. He did, however, admit to the planning of taking his own life to bring attention to the Alyssa case. Now, I've already shared that by 2008, Sarah had already started to doubt her father Mike on the disappearance of Alyssa. This speculation grew over time, and there's so many reasons why. Sarah would eventually come to the conclusion that the disappearance of Alyssa was solely on her father Mike. So Sarah actually became the driver in building a case against Mike. She even built the website justiceforalyssa.com. On her website, she created a blog, and this blog shared the 5 main reasons why she thinks that Mike was involved in the disappearance of Alyssa. The number one thing that she brought up was the abuse. Detectives had already asked friends and family about any suspected abuse that may have happened to Alyssa during her time in Phoenix, Arizona. Surprisingly, over 20 statements were made to the police claiming some form of physical or sexual abuse from her stepfather, Mike. There were also letters written by Alyssa describing the abuse. Her boyfriend also recalled one time that Alyssa had told him that her stepfather, Mike, had driven her out somewhere deserted and started physically abusing her. On Sarah's blog, Sarah wrote the following: "The relationship our father had with Alyssa is commonly described by those who knew her as one closer to an abusive boyfriend rather than a fatherly figure. He was extremely possessive, often sitting in the parking lot of Alyssa's part-time job to ensure she was where she was supposed to be. He constantly warned her friends and their parents of how she was gullible and unable to take care of herself. He also required Alyssa to sign behavioural contracts that included a clause stating that he had never sexually or physically abused her. My father did not display this behaviour with any of his other 5 children. This abuse and the fear of it becoming public knowledge is what I believe to be his strongest motive to murder Alyssa." Old video footage shows Mike's strange behaviour with Alyssa. He would often record her in places like the swimming pool.
Stop!
Stop what?
You didn't carry me, go away.
You guys don't want pictures?
Stop! Please? Please? I like it.
All while at work. This was likely a tactic to intimidate his own stepdaughter. The next key reason she talked about was means and opportunity. You see, we already know that Mike had lied to the police about the day that Alyssa went missing. He claimed he picked Sarah up from school, and this gave him an alibi from about 3:30 p.m. onwards. But Sarah remembers the day differently. He never picked her up, or at least not until after 5 p.m, from a friend's house. This means that if he did in fact murder Alyssa, then he had a time span to murder her and dispose of the body from around about 11 a.m. all the way through to 5 p.m. One witness had also reported to the police that shortly before Alyssa's disappearance, that Mike had bought a large amount of lye. For those that don't know what lye is, it's a metal hydroxide which speeds up the decomposition of a human body. Lye is also used to make soap. Mike acknowledged the purchase, but he refused to explain to the police what he needed it for. Mike also has great knowledge of the desert area around Arizona. His familiarity with the complete vastness of that area, along with the convenient purchase of lye, leaves us with a pretty obvious strategy. Mike also owned 2 trucks, both of them identical, one of which he always hid from his friends and family. Now, very conveniently, both were sold shortly after the disappearance of Alyssa. Another strong indicator talked about Mike's deceit and lying. We already know about some of his manipulative behaviour. First, the apparent runaway note. Second, Mike's sense of urgency to family and friends. As a former law enforcement officer, it's very reasonable to think he would know how to report a person missing without causing much concern to the police. He also never told his family or friends that he took Alyssa out early that day. That came out later on, many years later. Instead, he told them that she'd run away with a biker. He even told one of his older sons that Alyssa was killed by an assassin hired by the electrical union. He also refused to give his DNA to the police, and to this day still refuses to take an interview with the police. So the last bit of damning evidence that Sarah talks about is about a recording that she planted during a conversation between her and her father, Mike. In October 2017, shortly after Mike was released from jail, Mike vaguely confesses to Sarah on Alyssa's disappearance.
So, mine and Alyssa's father has been the only person of interest in Alyssa's case for almost 10 years. Yet, the police have never interviewed him. So, I did it myself. And here's what he had to say when I asked him what happened to Alyssa.
Be there at the deathbed, Sarah, and I'll give you all the honest answers you want to hear.
Why don't you give them to me now?
Because you got them now.
Then why are you making me this offer to go to your deathbed?
Well, Sarah, what are you looking for?
This was apparently still not enough for the Arizona PD. So in 2018, Sarah decided to ramp up her vocalization strategy with media. she's been campaigning on Facebook and Twitter and TikTok, and talking in various podcasts raising awareness of the disappearance of her sister Alyssa. This mounted pressure on the Arizona PD to investigate deeper into the case of Alyssa, and actually helped bring out new evidence in 2019. We don't quite know what details emerged, but it worked.
And now to tonight's other big story. A 20-year-old cold case finally ends with an arrest. Michael Turney is now facing murder charges in the case of his missing daughter, Alyssa.
Alyssa's sister never gave up trying to find justice for her sister, most recently using social media to keep her story in the spotlight. Team 12's William Pitts shows us what finally led to the arrest.
On Thursday, the 20th of August 2020, just 4 months after Sarah started using TikTok as a platform, country attorney Alistair Adele announced at a press conference that a grand jury concluded and charged Michael Turney with second-degree murder over Alyssa's death. He was arrested that day. Mike Turney has had his initial court appearance where he still maintains his innocence. So, what do I think happened to Alissa Turney? Alyssa was a very young girl when she lost her mother. Through coincidence more than anything, this left her at the care of her stepfather, Mike Turney. Mike should have been her father as she grew up. However, in Alyssa's younger, more vulnerable and more impressionable years as a child, Mike started taking advantage of Alyssa. Through reports of friends and family, it's likely that Mike abused Alyssa as she grew up. Alyssa was 17 when she went missing. She was starting to become independent, and she started forming her own independent opinions on life and herself and others. We know that Alyssa and Mike started to argue more during her final year or two of being around. It's likely that Alyssa started to challenge Mike's actions and behaviours with her. It's only a matter of time until she would start speaking out against Mike to other people. And Mike knew this. Fearing for his own innocence and freedom, Mike knew he had to do something. So it's most likely that, in order to silence Alyssa, Michael Turney most likely murdered his own stepdaughter. He took advantage of the final school day to reduce consequential student interaction with Alyssa. He did this by taking Alyssa out early for lunch. When he and Alyssa got home, he probably forced Alyssa to write a runaway letter. He then took her to the desert and killed her. Knowing the desert canvas well, he knew a very good place to hide the body, and using light on the body to speed up the process. Being a previous member of law enforcement, he knew exactly how to avoid getting caught. He used the story of picking up Sarah as an alibi for himself, and to conceal the time frame of opportunity for when he killed Alyssa in that day. He then downplayed the police by leading them to believe that she had actually run away, and Mike then lied to his family and friends to create panic and confusion. Getting a phone call from Alyssa a week later in California was a total lie. His actions in minimizing alerts to the police and consistently downplaying her disappearance meant that no investigation had happened in the first 7 years. This meant that all cameras and phone recordings and school reports were gone by the time that investigations had started happening 7 years later. Mike Turney was abusive, paranoid, heartless, and opportunistic. His manipulative behavior helped him get away with all of that. I mean, Alissa Turney was just starting her life, really. She was smart, funny, strong, and caring. She loved her sister a lot, but she relied on Mike to be her parent. He took advantage of that, took advantage of her, and took her life away from her, all for the benefit of his own. It's incredible how long it took to charge Mike Turney. This case was pretty obvious to me from the very beginning. And who knows what would have happened if it wasn't for the perseverance and tenacity of her younger sister, Sarah.
You got me in trouble, Dad.
How'd I do that?
Hi there, and thank you so much for watching another video of mine. If you enjoyed this case and would like to see the same kind of thing again, please consider subscribing or leaving a like on the video. What do you think happened to Alissa Turney? Do you think that she was murdered? Do you think Mike murdered her? Or do you think someone else was to play in this? Please let me know what you think below. I'd love to hear other people's thoughts, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care of each other.